Hello, Agile friends, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we're building software in an agile manner, day in and day out. How are you doing, audience? Are you all right? Are you doing okay? Do you need anything? Do you need something? If you do need something, then you have a dependency. And that's what today's topic is going to be about. How in an agile world can we best manage dependencies, specifically dependencies between teams? Now, there is one very common way in the agile world that we have typically approached the dependency issue, and I am going to talk about that. It is a great way to approach it. But I also want to share with you an alternative that you might consider as well that may fit your context better than the way 98% of the coaches are telling you you need to handle your dependencies. Having said that, there's a reason 98% of coaches tell you to handle it that way, and that's because it's awesome too. So I'm going to start with that one and transition into the other one. But first, let's talk about what it means for your team to have a dependency. Basically, it boils down to your team needs something to move forward, but they don't have it. The team itself can't produce that thing. It has to come from the outside. And so they have a dependency. Why can the team not generate this thing? Well, there's any number of reasons. Maybe not enough people in your organization know how to produce that thing. So let's say, for example, that the product that you're building requires very highly technical and highly specialized subject matter knowledge. And maybe you only have one or two people in your company that have that knowledge that they can tell the developers. Maybe they're the only ones that know the algorithm. I did a project not very long ago for a company that needed program around a chain pull force equation. And there was exactly one person in the whole company that knew the chain pull force equation. So anybody that needed that expertise, there was only one person who could give it. So dependencies were created because obviously this person can't be everywhere at once and they can't be talking to everyone at once who may need their expertise. Perhaps they can't produce it because there are regulations that prohibit it. You know, some of you listening to me probably work in environments where SOX compliance is an issue or other kinds of regulatory compliance is an issue. And you may have regulations about things your developers can and can't do. Maybe your developers can't do their own releases. Maybe your developers are not allowed to touch the database, and another group has to do that. It could be that perhaps you have a skill set where there's not enough demand to fully allocate a team member to that skill set. So for some companies, this might be database administration. In any given development team, maybe there's not enough DBA kind of work that fully dedicating a DBA to that team isn't a good expenditure of time and money. So instead, they have a team of DBAs, or they have a DBA who is fractionally shared among teams or something like that. One example that I'll come back to later is we had a client where we were building a web application for them, but a handful of features required interaction with their mainframe, with their AS400. And so there wasn't really enough there to fully dedicate a mainframe person to our team because, like I said, there was only a handful of features that needed to interact with the mainframe. If we fully dedicated someone on our team, they wouldn't be doing anything the vast majority of the time. So our team had a dependency. We did not have a full-time mainframe person with those skills on our team. And so that's an example of a team's dependency. Now, a dependency is not always a skill set, and it's not always esoteric knowledge. It can really be anything that the team needs to move forward but doesn't have. It could be financial. It could be that they have questions about requirements and somebody else can answer those questions, but they are not fully dedicated to the team, or they're not available to the team all the time for whatever reason. A dependency can kind of be anything. But today, I would like to focus more on cross-team dependencies. So you see these a lot in organizations where, say, you have a team of developers, then over here, you've got the UI UX team, or over here, you've got the database team, or over here, you've got the reporting team. Over here, you got the AS400 team. Here's ops, living over here. I was at a client one time that had a team that did the logical database designs, and then another team that did the physical database design and implementation. So I've never been to a client that has sliced up responsibilities between teams so thinly as that, but it was certainly an experience working in an environment like that. But that's the kind of thing I'm going to focus on mostly today is you've got a development team and there's some kind of technical obstacle that if someone on the team knew how to do it, they would just do it. But for whatever reason, that's not what's going to happen. So you have a dependency on another team in order to get that thing done. So how do we deal with that situation? We're in an environment where we're trying to increase our agility. We've got team A of developers. They're cranking stuff out, but then we get to that thing that they're not able to supply themselves. Maybe it's UI wireframes, or maybe it's that interaction with the AS400. What do? Well, by far and away, the most recommended option from most Agile practitioners is that you eliminate as many dependencies as possible by pulling onto your team all the functions that need to happen in order for your team to deliver. So rather than having, the programming team and the database team and the UI team and so on and so forth, you have one team, and this team involves members of all those disciplines, so that the team as a collective does not need to reach outside of itself for other things. So you eliminate dependencies through cross-functionality. Think about like the A team. Some of my listeners, you will have no point of reference as to who I'm talking about. But for those of you who are around my age or so, give or take, there was this show on TV called the A Team, and there were 4 people on the A Team. There was Hannibal, who was kind of the team lead, kind of the general. You had Face, who was, as the name implies, the party face. He was the diplomat. He would go in front of people, get things done. You had Murdoch, who was the technical person. And then you had B.A. Baracus, who beat people up. So they all kind of had their 4 areas of expertise. And then together as a team, they got stuff done because they all had skills they could contribute. And in fact, a lot of special forces in the military are kind of organized around this same way. If you look, for example, at a SEAL team or a command and control team, you will have a team of people who share a certain common skill set, but each one also has a unique specialization that they bring to the mission so the team can fully execute everything that they need to do. And this is the most popular way for Agile teams to deal with this problem, is through cross-functionality. You just keep adding people to your team who have these skill sets so that you don't have to reach outside of your team for these skill sets. In these environments, you hear talk sometimes about having T-shaped people. That's T as in the letter T. Also not to be confused with Mr. T, who used to play B.A. Baracus on the A team. Did you follow all that? Anyway, but they talk about the letter T, T-shaped people, which means that they have a certain general skill set across the board where they have some skills in many different areas, but then they have very deep skill set in 1 or 2 or 3 skill areas. So very deep skills in a narrow set, but a general level of competence across a very wide set. Truth be told, a lot of software developers kind of look like this by default, mostly because of our training and past work experience. So we might not be as strong on the front end as another developer who is always working on the front end, but pretty much every software developer can do something in the front end, even if it doesn't look that great. Pretty much every developer can create a database table, even if it's not as well designed as someone who's really, really focused on databases. Well, certainly reducing dependencies can be helpful. There's a reason this is the most popular way to do it, and it's because if a team is constantly being bottlenecked because of a skill set they don't have, by far and away, the easiest and most efficient and most cost-effective way to solve that is to put someone on the team who has that skill set or has that knowledge base, or allow your team to invest in acquiring that skill set. So maybe nobody on your team knows how to work on an AS400, but if you find yourself having to work on an AS400 all the time, it would probably behoove your team for someone to learn how to do that, right? So you aren't always having to reach out to other teams, because this is the whole thing that makes cross-team dependencies such a bottleneck to productivity, is you have to wait on that other team, right? You have to submit that request to that other team, and probably they haven't been sitting around all day waiting for you to send a request to them. They're probably just as busy as you are, busy with their own things, and they're going to have to figure out how they're going to work your request into the mix, and you don't know when it's going to be done. So that's what makes the cross-team dependency thing so unattractive to organizations, is the time lost as teams reach outside of themselves for something they need, and then they have to wait for that thing before they can move forward. And if any of you have had to work maybe with vendors where you were in a similar position, you know how frustrating that can be, right? You ask the vendor for something you need, and then you wait and wait and wait and wait, and you never really know when that's going to be delivered, and you can move forward with whatever the thing is. So if you can eliminate that dependency altogether, just think of all the time you get back. If all of a sudden I can have someone on my team who's fully dedicated to the team, who is ready to go as soon as we need it to happen, and who has that vested interest in delivery that's very closely connected to the rest of the team's vested interest in delivery, well, you got a recipe for success most of the time, right? You've made a great stride forward in the ability for that team to produce. But here's the thing, that works great when that particular dependency is a fairly constant drain on the team's productivity. When this is a bottleneck they run into with some degree of frequency. If it's a bottleneck they don't run into very frequently, then the situation gets a little more complicated because it's going to take time for that person to learn that skill set. Well, if this is a bottleneck that only crops up once or twice a year, is it going to be worth the time it takes to have someone stop what they're doing, acquire this new skill set just so they can alleviate that bottleneck once or twice a year? If you decide to solve it by putting someone on the team who already has that skill set, well, now we have to think about, is there going to be enough of that bottleneck for that person to be an asset, right? Because again, if this is something the team only runs into sporadically, what's that person going to be doing the rest of the time? How are they going to help the team move forward the rest of the time? I mean, hey, no one's a bigger fan than I am of having the team be idle sometimes. Having slack in your system is a good thing. But there's a difference between having slack in your system and most of your system being slack. And if you have someone who just kind of sits around with the team all day for most of their time, and then once every couple of weeks springs into action, takes care of their area of expertise, and then goes back to being idle, that's probably not a great expenditure of the company's bandwidth either. So again, this is a great way to take care of the dependency issue, but it's not a slam dunk. You have to think about, is this really going to be worth the time and expense to allocate somebody fully to the team to eliminate that dependency and get that efficiency gain? In some cases, the answer is absolutely 100% yes. I'm a big fan of making your teams cross-functional, adding people who have the skills so they are on the team, they're invested with the team, they're in the same boat with the team. I think that's a great way to do it. But there are going to be situations where that is just not the best thing you could be doing. It's just not the best use of your time, their time, or the company's resources in general. So I want to talk about another option. And I struggled with what to call this option. I don't have a cute name for it. For the time being, I'm going to call it dependencies as micro companies. This works best when you have a situation where teams are organized by skill set, or at least I should say some of the teams are organized by skill set. I think for any company that is trying to increase their agility, most of your teams should be cross-functional to some extent or another. But nevertheless, you're going to run into situations where it just doesn't pay to have a full-time allocated person dedicated to a team with a particular skill set or a particular knowledge base. And in those cases, organizations will often form teams of experts out of that skill set or out of that knowledge base. For example, you may have a single UI UX team that does work across all your developer teams, or a single team of DBAs, or a single team of people who work with your legacy systems like the AS400. So if you're in that situation where you generally have cross-functional teams, but you have these specialist teams out there that aren't fully dedicated, that kind of serve all teams, I'm going to suggest running them as kind of like their own little companies. Now, in order to do this, another thing you have to have is a pretty good handle on flow metrics. If you aren't doing a good job with flow metrics, then this option is probably not going to work out super great. So that's something to keep in mind. I think all teams that take in requests for work and deliver those requests for work, you can have flow metrics. So there's no reason that your teams can't have flow metrics. There's no reason the DBA team can't have flow metrics. There's no reason the UI UX team can't have flow metrics. But you're going to have them in order for the system to work. So if you don't have those, if that's something your organization does not have a lot of, focus on that first. That's step one. There are podcasts in the past that I've done on that, and I'm certainly, as an individual, am willing to help you out with that as well. But you're going to need that. But let's say you've got those things. I've got specialist teams, and my specialist teams have a really good handle on their flow metrics. If this is the case, then you should be in a great position for a developer team to ask that team, how much lead time are you going to need on a request before you can start working on it? And when can we reasonably expect delivery of most of our requests? Any team should be able to answer that question very quickly. If your teams can't answer that question, that means there's an issue with your flow metrics, right? But if they have that, they should be able to answer those questions very quickly. And if that's the case, now you are on the road to coordinating with your dependencies without having to have people be T-shaped or without having to disperse your specialists amongst all your teams. Because let's take the example of the team that does AS400 work. And I'm on a developer team. And I noticed that, out of our 40 user stories that are coming up, 5 of them have to interact with the AS400. So what I can tell the AS400 team is I can ask them, how much lead time are you going to need from a request before you'll be able to get around to it? And once you've got it in your queue, about how long will it take before we can expect delivery? And if I have those pieces of information, I can work with that team because I have my own flow metrics, right? So when I see that user story 17 is going to need some AS400 work, and the AS400 team has told me we need 2 weeks of lead time before we can get to your request, then when I see that I'm about 2 weeks out from user story 17, I just tell them, hey, we've got a user story coming down the pike. It needs some AS400 work. We are about 2 weeks out, and that's about how long you're going to need. So I'm letting you know right now. And we can have a discussion about the requirements of that. We can do whatever you would like to do prior to the time this hits your queue. But otherwise, I'm letting you know, I'm putting this in the mix. We're going to need this request started in 2 weeks. Or maybe I decide I need it delivered by that time. And so I give them even more notice, knowing that maybe they have a 85% delivery time of 13 days. So the point is I'm treating them almost like a vendor, and they are treating me like a customer, right? And just like any other vendor who's doing business with many different customers with many different requests, I just need to know, how busy are you? And what are my expectations realistically going to be, so that then when I look at my own flow, I can make sure we're lined up, right? And this works for all kinds of things. It not only works for technical expertise, it can even work for things like requirements. We had a client once, and I told them, how much lead time do you need before you'll be in a position to give us the next batch of requirements? And they said, well, we need about 2 weeks. And I said, okay, great. When my team is about 2 weeks out from running out of user stories, then I'll let you know. And then we will have a meeting in 2 weeks and generate new user stories and new acceptance criteria with you together. And that system worked great because we had a really good grasp of how much lead time we needed and what the delivery cycles look like on both sides. When you have that, you can coordinate dependencies without needing to eliminate. And that can be great because now we're building trust between these groups, and we are having realistic expectations between these groups. These groups can publish service level expectations. So when your teams are aware of what their workflow is and what their needs are, well, first of all, we can all be a lot more empathetic with each other because a lot of teams don't have that level of transparency. But if your teams do, if I know the AS400 team is swamped, and right now, any given request, it's going to be a month before they get around to it, I have empathy for that. Right? But not only do I have empathy for that, now I can work around it. Now I can give them a month's notice. And of course, whenever teams are working in this way, it is going to be very important that a representative from those teams attends your daily stand-up. And it's not so they can necessarily give a status report. It's so that your teams can stay synchronized in terms of where their team is at and where your team is at. So they know that you're coming up on that thing that you needed from them, and you know from them kind of where they're at on that thing that you needed from them. So definitely when you're working in this way, I think it's really important to have representatives from that team who's your dependency to be part of your daily stand-up, your daily planning for what the team is going to do that day to help keep that goal crossed. So I hope that helps. Again, if you can eliminate the dependency, if you can add a person with that skill set to your team, and it makes sense to do so, and their time is going to be well spent, then I absolutely recommend doing that. I think that's a great way to take care of the efficiency losses you get from cross-team dependencies. But in some cases, that might not work out. You're not going to get that person, or it's just not cost-effective to have that person fully dedicated. And when that's the case, just take your team of specialists and treat them like little companies, treat them like vendors, and you're their customer, and find out from them, when do they need to know that you need something, and when can you reasonably expect them to deliver on your request? If they've got good flow metrics, they should be able to tell you that. And if you've got good flow metrics, you should be able to work those expectations into your own planning quite easily. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.